She wasn't supposed to rule. She wasn't supposed to wear the crown. But when Egypt needed strength, she became more than a queen. She became a pharaoh. Her name was erased, her statue smashed, her legacy buried in sand. Yet her story refused to die. This is the rise, reign, and resurrection of Queen Hatshepsut, the woman who outsmarted empires, ruled like a god, and defied death itself. The sun over Thebes burned like a golden crown the day she was born. The priests whispered that the god Amun himself had breathed life into the child's body, a divine spark meant for greatness. She was named Hatshepsut, foremost of noble women. From the very beginning, her presence filled the palace with a strange and powerful calm. Her father, Thutmose I, was a warrior king who saw in her the sharpness of a ruler's mind. When he lifted her in his arms before the court, the high priest declared, "The blood of kings and the breath of gods meet in this one." The soldiers bowed. The scribes trembled. A girl in a world built for men had just been marked by destiny. Hatshepsut grew up among the colonnades of Karnak, where sacred chants echoed against pillars taller than dreams. She learned to read hieroglyphs, to measure stone, to debate philosophy with priests and generals, while other royal children played. She studied power quietly, relentlessly, in the temple courtyards. She watched the rituals of Amun, her eyes never missing a single movement. She began to believe what the priests once whispered, that she was chosen by the god himself, not merely as his daughter, but perhaps as his reflection on earth. When she walked through the palace, servants would part like the Nile before the sun, yet behind the silk curtains and the scent of lotus, there were whispers, "A woman cannot rule Egypt." But even as a child, Hatshepsut's heart didn't tremble, because deep inside, she already knew the crown would one day be hers not by inheritance, but by destiny. From the earliest light of dawn, the young Hatshepsut would rise before the palace stirred. While other princesses bathed in oils and perfumes, she walked barefoot into the temple courtyards, her linen robe brushing against the sacred dust of Thebes. She listened to the priests chant hymns to Amun, her supposed divine father, and memorized every word as though it were secret code to power. The gods fascinated her not as idols, but as forces. She studied Amun's hidden nature, Ra's eternal journey, and Osiris's resurrection. To Hatshepsut, religion wasn't simply faith, it was strategy, structure, and law. If the people believed the Pharaoh was divine, then to rule, one had to become divine in their eyes. Her tutors often marveled at her questions. "If mat is balance," she once asked, "then who restores it when men break it?" The old scholar hesitated. "Only Pharaoh can." She smiled softly, as if the answer confirmed what she already believed. In the afternoons, she trained in statcraft. She learned to read the ledgers of grain, the movements of armies, and the temper of generals. Her father sometimes took her to the borders, where she watched soldiers return from Nubia, dusty, scarred, yet proud. She saw how her father's presence silenced chaos. She wondered if one day her voice could do the same. In the evenings she would sit alone beneath the stars, her gaze fixed on the temple of Amun across the Nile. The torches flickered like beating hearts, and she whispered a promise into the wind. "If I am truly your daughter, Amun, then make Egypt see me, not as a woman, but as your chosen ruler." And somewhere beyond the desert's edge, as if the gods themselves were listening, a warm gust of wind swept through the palace, the kind that carried omens of destiny. When Hatshepsut came of age, tradition demanded she marry her half-brother Thutmose II to secure the royal bloodline. The court celebrated with drums and golden banners, but to her the wedding felt more like a treaty than a union. Thutmose was older, fragile, and far more interested in pleasure than power. Hatshepsut, however, watched everything: the ministers who flattered him, the generals who whispered behind him, the priests who measured their loyalty like gold dust. At the feast she wore a crown of lotus and lapis lazuli. When she looked across the hall, she didn't see a husband. She saw a throne she might one day protect. She smiled and played her role perfectly. She spoke softly, obeyed publicly, but her eyes burned with silent calculation. In the quiet nights of the palace, Hatshepsut took control in subtle ways. She met with scribes to learn the inner workings of the treasury. She advised her husband on temple endowments and foreign trade. When he faltered, she stepped forward, always in his name, never in her own. The court began to whisper, "It is the queen who truly rules." Thutmose, too, weary and sickly, didn't notice how her influence spread like light over the Nile. Officials began to seek her approval. Soldiers awaited her command. And in those moments, Hatshepsut discovered something intoxicating: the art of invisible power. Yet she knew such control was fragile. Egypt had never accepted a woman as pharaoh. To survive, she would need to master patience, disguise her strength, and wait for the world to give her the opening she needed. That opening would come sooner than anyone expected, with the death of a king. As the years passed, the golden halls of Thebes grew quieter. The once vibrant court had become a nest of whispers, where loyalty shifted like desert sand. Thutmose II's health worsened, his body thin and pale beneath silk robes. Every cough echoed through the palace like a warning bell. Hatshepsut moved carefully through these shadows. Ministers argued over who would rule if the king died. The priests debated the will of Amun, and deep within the palace, servants carried rumors like poisoned arrows. The queen desires the throne. She smiled at those whispers and never denied them. Instead, she used them. Each rumor drew attention away from her real work, building alliances. She courted the temple of Amun, gifting them gold and new shrines. She spoke gently with generals, reminding them how her father once trusted her counsel. Piece by piece, she wove a network of power tighter than any crown. But not all eyes were kind. The royal harem seethed with jealousy. A secondary wife of Thutmose bore a son, a boy who could one day challenge her. The birth of Thutmose III changed everything. For the first time, Hatshepsut felt a cold tremor of danger beneath her calm. One night, as she walked through the moonlit corridors, a loyal servant whispered, "Your Majesty, the king's time nears its end." She stopped. The scent of burning myrrh filled the air. Somewhere distant, the priests began the first prayers for the dying. Hatshepsut turned her gaze toward the stars, her heart steady. The throne was about to become empty, and Egypt would soon need someone strong enough to hold it. In the silence of that night, a queen began to dream of becoming Pharaoh. The day Thutmose II died, Thebes fell silent. Black banners fluttered above the palace. Incense thickened the air. The court gathered in trembling order, pretending grief while calculating the next move. The king's body was prepared for the afterlife, wrapped in linen and secrets, but the real battle was among the living. The child heir, Thutmose III, was too young to rule, a fragile boy born from a lesser wife. Egypt stood at the edge of uncertainty, a kingdom rich and restless, with no hand strong enough to steer it. Hatshepsut appeared before the council draped in white. her face composed, her eyes unreadable. "Until the boy becomes a man," she said softly, "I will guard the throne as his regent. I will protect what is his, and what is Egypt's." No one dared oppose her. The priests owed her their temples. The generals owed her their promotions. The people trusted her lineage as the daughter of Thutmose I, yet beneath their bowed heads suspicion flickered. A woman holding the power of Pharaoh, even temporarily, was dangerous. In the quiet of the embalming chamber, Hatshepsut watched her husband's golden mask lowered onto his face. She whispered, "You ruled in name, but I will rule in truth." For the first time she allowed herself to imagine it, the double crown resting upon her own brow. But she knew Egypt's gods were watching, and so were its men. To become Pharaoh, she would have to play the most delicate game of all, appear loyal to the boy king, while slowly reshaping destiny itself. And so began the reign of the silent ruler behind the throne, the woman who would one day stop hiding her name. The boy king Thutmose III sat on the throne, small and uncertain, his crown too heavy for his young head. She ruled in his name, but her decisions shaped the kingdom. She chaired the councils, signed the decrees, commanded the armies. Every message carried her seal. Every temple whispered her orders. Yet in every proclamation she made sure to include the name of the boy Pharaoh, keeping the illusion of loyalty alive. The court pretended to believe it. The priests nodded respectfully, the nobles bowed deeply, but everyone knew where the true power rested. Egypt began to prosper again. The granaries overflowed, trade routes revived, and temples rose under her supervision. Still, the whispers never stopped. "She is no regent," they said in the shadows. "She is a ruler wearing patience like armor." And perhaps they were right. Hatshepsut watched how the people loved her, how they trusted her judgment, how they turned to her for stability. The gods seemed to favor her, too. The floods came on time, the harvests were rich, the enemies quiet. In the stillness of her private chambers, she began to wonder if Amun himself was guiding her hand. Then one night, as she stood before the great statue of Amun in Karnak, the torches flickering like stars, she whispered, "If I am your daughter, then let me rule not as guardian, but as Pharaoh." The next morning a hawk, the sacred symbol of kingship, landed on the palace roof. The priests called it an omen. Hatshepsut called it a sign. She would no longer rule behind a boy. She would rule as Egypt's living god. The temple bells rang across Thebes like thunder. The air smelled of lotus and burning myrrh as thousands gathered along the Nile to witness what no one had dared imagine, a woman ascending the throne of Egypt. Hatshepsut stepped forward in shimmering gold, her face calm, her gaze fierce. The priests of Amun chanted in rhythm, their voices echoing between stone columns carved with her father's victories. When the sacred crown was placed upon her head, the people gasped. The blue and gold Nenes headdress framed her face like the sun's halo. "Behold," the high priest declared, "the one born of Amun, the rightful ruler of the two lands." In that instant, Hatshepsut transformed. Her titles changed. She was now Matker Hatshepsut. Truth is the soul of Era. But her transformation wasn't merely in words. The coronation was a masterstroke of political genius. She declared that Amun had come to her mother in the form of her father Thutmose, making her both divine and legitimate. Her enemies couldn't argue with the gods. As the drums thundered, she raised the crook and flail, symbols of kingship, and spoke in a voice that silenced the crowd. I am the daughter of Amun. He placed the crown upon my head. Egypt shall know no weakness while I live. The river reflected her image like a mirror of destiny. For the first time in history, the most powerful empire on earth bowed to a woman, and the heavens did not strike her down, but with divinity came danger. And Hatshepsut knew that the higher one rises toward the gods, the more shadows begin to gather beneath. Long before she wore the double crown, Hatshepsut had been given the sacred title God's wife of Amun. But now, as Pharaoh, she wielded it like a divine sword. It wasn't just a title. It was a bridge between mortal and God, a claim that her power came directly from the heavens, not from men. Every dawn, she walked through the grand halls of Karnak Temple, the morning light striking the golden hieroglyphs that told her story. How Amun had chosen her mother, how she herself was the god's earthly daughter. The priests recited these tales daily, until myth became truth, and truth became law. Hatshepsut understood something few rulers ever did. Belief could be stronger than armies. She poured treasures into the temple, alabaster altars, golden boats, sacred perfumes, until even the priests knelt before her not as queen, but as deity. She built chapels bearing her image alongside that of Amun, her face serene, eternal, divine. Her enemies grumbled in silence. They couldn't challenge a ruler blessed by the God they served. Her authority became untouchable, not because she was feared, but because she was sanctified. In private moments, however, she remained human, reflecting by the flickering light of oil lamps, her eyes tracing the stars above the Nile. Did she truly believe she was the daughter of a god, or had she simply become the story Egypt needed her to be? Either way, it worked. Her reign grew unshakable, her name sacred, and as her legend deepened, she began her boldest transformation yet, to become Pharaoh in both spirit and form. The statues came first, massive figures of polished limestone, carved not as a queen, but as a pharaoh, broad chest, false beard. Only the eyes, sharp and knowing, betrayed the truth. This was still Hatshepsut. It was no accident. She had ordered every sculptor, every painter, every scribe to craft her image in the likeness of kings. The people see what they are told to see, she once said to her architects. If they see a man, they will forget a woman ever ruled them. Her transformation wasn't vanity, it was strategy. She wore the beard of Osiris, the Nenes crown of Thutmose I, and the cobra of divine protection. Her inscription shifted from daughter of Amun to son of Amun. To the eyes of Egypt, she had become both, a living embodiment of balance, where male and female, mortal and divine, existed as one. In ceremony she spoke with a steady, commanding tone, her gestures disciplined like the gods of stone that lined the temples. The court bowed to her as Pharaoh, and slowly the disbelief faded. Egypt had not fallen. The Nile still flooded. The sun still rose. But beneath the triumph lay a dangerous truth. Her illusion had to remain perfect. One crack, one whisper, and the dream of a woman pharaoh could crumble like a statue in the desert wind. In her private chambers she sometimes removed the false beard, and stared into the polished bronze mirror. The reflection that stared back was no longer the princess who studied the gods. It was something greater, something lonelier. "I became what they could follow," she murmured, "and what they will never forget." When Hatshepsut dreamed, she dreamed in stone. She envisioned a monument that would speak across millennia, a temple not built for her ego, but to prove her divinity. She called it Djeser-Djeser-Ru, the Holy of Holies, the temple we now know as Deir el-Bahari. The cliffs of western Thebes rose like a wall of gold above the desert, and there she commanded her architects to carve terraces straight into the mountain's heart. Leading the work was Senenmut, her most trusted advisor, and, as rumor whispered, the man who knew her truest self. Together they designed a structure unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Ramp after ramp led upward through rows of colossal columns. Friezes showed Hatshepsut's divine birth, her coronation, her voyages, history rewritten in stone until it became eternal truth. When the sun struck the temple at dawn, its light flowed through the columns and touched the inner sanctum like a blessing from Amun himself. Thousands of workers labored under the desert heat. She ordered fair rations, cool water, and songs to keep their rhythm. "Let them remember they build for the gods," she told Senenmut, "and for Egypt's peace." Under her rule, architecture became faith made visible, a statement that stability was divine, and she was its vessel. When the temple neared completion, Hatshepsut stood before it in silence. The cliffs glowed behind her, the Nile shimmered below, and her image stood immortalized in every column. "I have raised this temple," she said softly, "so that when the gods forget men's names, they will still speak mine." And they did. The stones of Deir el-Bahari would outlast empires. But her greatest act of daring was yet to come, a voyage beyond Egypt itself. The morning the ships of Punt set sail, Thebes trembled with awe. The Nile shimmered with sunlight, reflecting the sails of 5 great vessels lined with cedar masts and painted eyes to see through the unknown seas. Hatshepsut stood upon the harbor platform, her golden robe flowing like sunlight itself. This was no war fleet. It was a voyage of peace, trade, and glory. She had ordered the expedition to the mystical land of Punt, a place the Egyptians called God's land. Few had ever reached it. Its riches were spoken of in temple hymns, myrrh trees, gold, ivory, panther skins, and incense so pure it was said to please the gods directly. For Hatshepsut, this journey wasn't only about wealth, it was about legitimacy. To rule like a god, she would need to prove that even the world's farthest lands answered her call. The ships moved through the Red Sea for weeks, facing winds and waves that tested even the bravest sailors. When they finally reached Punt, the air was heavy with spice, and strange trees rose from the shore like emerald towers. The Queen of Punt welcomed them with laughter and gifts, marveling at Egypt's grandeur. Trade began incense, ebony, gold, and exotic animals for Egyptian linen, jewelry, and weapons. When the expedition returned, the people of Thebes gathered to see the treasures. Incense trees replanted in Karnak's courtyards. Exotic animals paraded through the streets, gold stacked like sunlight. The walls of Deir el-Bahari soon echoed with carvings of this triumph. Hatshepsut shaking hands with the Queen of Punt, their union carved forever in stone. This voyage proved that Egypt thrived not through conquest, but through vision. Under Hatshepsut, the Nile's wealth stretched beyond the horizon. She had shown that a woman could rule not through force, but through brilliance. The gods had blessed her. The people adored her. But even the gods know perfection invites envy. Under Hatshepsut's rule, Egypt entered an age so calm and radiant that scribes called it the time when Ma at herself walked among men. The wars that had drained the kingdom's strength faded into memory. Instead of blood, the Nile carried perfume and gold. She strengthened trade routes from Nubia to the Mediterranean, reopened quarries long abandoned, and ordered fleets to bring cedar from Lebanon for her endless building projects. Granaries overflowed, temples multiplied. Even the poorest villages felt the warmth of the crown's generosity. The economy thrived like a garden after rain. Every decree she issued carried her steady wisdom. Build, not burn. Grow, not conquer. Egypt's soldiers became builders. Its builders became artists, and its people became loyal beyond fear. The treasury grew rich enough to gild the gods themselves. At Karnak she ordered new obelisks of rose granite to pierce the sky. One of them, over 90 feet tall, was raised in record time, polished until it gleamed like the sun's own spear. She dedicated it to Amun, her divine father, and inscribed upon it, "I have done this with a heart that loves my father Amun more than any king has loved him." The people saw not a queen, but a living bridge between heaven and earth. Her portraits flooded the temples, serene, timeless, divine. No famine struck, no rebellion rose. For nearly 2 decades, peace ruled the two lands, but peace, though glorious, breeds complacency. In the quiet corners of the palace, a few began to murmur, "What happens when the boy king becomes a man?" The boy, Thutmose III, now grown, watched the empire his stepmother had built, and wondered what would remain for him when she was gone. The seeds of envy, once planted, began to take root in the shadows. Behind the marble columns and golden corridors of Thebes, secrets stirred like the desert wind. Among them, none was whispered more often or more carefully than the bond between Hatshepsut and Senenmut. Senenmut was not born noble. He was a man of skill, not lineage, an architect, a scholar, a servant who rose through brilliance alone. Hatshepsut saw in him what few others did: loyalty without ambition, intelligence without deceit. She made him her chief architect, steward of her estates, tutor to her daughter Neferu, and if the rumors were true, her confidant in every sense. Together they shaped Egypt's golden age. Senenmut oversaw the temples, the obelisks, the royal tombs. He carried her seal, spoke her will, guarded her secrets. His name appeared beside hers in inscriptions few others dared share. For a commoner to rise so high under a pharaoh was unthinkable, unless love had played its quiet part. At night, the palace guards spoke of lights burning in her private chambers, long after the stars rose. In the morning, her decisions were sharper, her resolve unbreakable. Whether their connection was divine or human, it became one of history's most whispered mysteries. But even in devotion, shadows grew. The priests grew uneasy, too much power in one man's hands. The generals watched Senenmut with envy. The young Thutmose III watched them both with cold silence. Still, Hatshepsut trusted him completely. She gave him permission to carve his image in her mortuary temple, a privilege reserved only for kings. It was the ultimate sign of favor, and perhaps affection. Yet power built on secrecy never rests easy. As the queen's monuments touched the sky, so too did the jealousy of those below. And in Egypt, envy was more dangerous than any blade. Power, no matter how divine, always casts a shadow. By her 20th year on the throne, Hatshepsut's glory was unmatched. But beneath the gold of her temples, something dark began to stir. The generals, once loyal to her father, grumbled in the war camps. Egypt has forgotten conquest, they said. We are ruled by a builder, not a warrior. The priests, grown fat from her offerings, whispered among themselves, had the Pharaoh grown too close to the mortal world, too confident in her divinity? And in the palace one man watched everything. Thutmose III, no longer a boy, but a young man burning with quiet ambition. He had been trained as a warrior, hardened in the army while his stepmother ruled from her marble throne. The soldiers adored him. The scent of rebellion reached his tent like smoke before a fire. Still, Hatshepsut refused to yield. Egypt does not need more tombs for soldiers, she said coldly when her council pressed for war. It needs temples for gods and homes for the living. Her logic was sound, but pride has enemies reason cannot silence. Rumors began to crawl through the streets like serpents. She conspires with Senenmut. She defies the will of Amun. The gods will punish a woman who wears the beard of a man. Then, one morning, Senenmut vanished. His name was suddenly erased from inscriptions, his statues defaced. Some said he had been executed. Others swore he fled into the desert, taking his secrets with him. Hatshepsut never spoke his name again, but those close to her noticed a change, a silence heavier than stone. She began to appear less often in public, her face calm but her eyes distant. The empire still thrived, but the harmony that once protected her had begun to fracture. For the first time, Egypt's immortal queen felt the breath of mortality. Even as whispers filled the air and allies faded into silence, Hatshepsut never stopped building. It was her answer to betrayal, her defiance against time itself. If loyalty could crumble, stone would not. She poured her will into monuments, temple, and trade, each one a declaration. I was here. I ruled. I endured. Her projects reached from Nubia to Sinai. The roads thrived with caravans. The temples sang her name daily. The obelisks she raised pierced the heavens like frozen sunlight. She turned Egypt into a canvas of her reign, peace, order, and divine power carved into eternity. The scribes wrote that under her the Nile never failed to flood, the harvest never withered, and the gods smiled upon the land. She redefined kingship not as conquest, but as creation. No pharaoh before her had balanced faith, politics, and art with such precision. Her daughter, Nefer-Yah, once a child at her feet, grew into a poised young priestess, walking the same sacred paths her mother once did. Hatshepsut saw in her the mirror of her own spirit, intelligent, curious, unafraid. She hoped Nefer would continue her legacy, perhaps even rule one day, but fate is cruel to dreams born of power. As the queen aged, her strength began to fade, though she never admitted it. Her voice still carried command, her gaze still silenced courtiers, but the years weighed upon her heart. She began to spend long hours in her temple at Deir el-Bahari, staring at the carvings that told her story, her divine birth, her coronation, her triumphs. I built to outlast death, she whispered once to a priest, yet even stone forgets. Still, she believed that as long as Egypt stood, her name would never vanish. She didn't yet know that the greatest betrayal of her life was still to come, and it would arrive not from enemies, but from blood. The palace had grown quieter. The courtyards that once echoed with music and proclamations now filled only with the rustle of palm leaves and the slow steps of servants. Hatshepsut, once radiant with divine energy, moved with the calm dignity of someone who knew time was catching her. Her hair, once black as obsidian, was now veiled beneath gold. The royal physicians whispered of a lingering illness, perhaps an infection, perhaps the slow poison of age. Still, she refused to appear weak before anyone. A pharaoh, she said, does not fade. She sets like the sun, to rise again. Thutmose III, now a man grown and commander of Egypt's armies, returned to Thebes often. Their meetings were polite but cold. He knelt, he spoke the rituals, but behind his eyes burned years of silent resentment. He wanted the throne she still held, and she knew it, yet she never declared him her enemy. Instead, she appointed him to lead campaigns, to rule in her name during her absences, a gesture both generous and dangerous. Perhaps she believed she could shape his ambition, or perhaps she wished to leave Egypt stable before her end. At night she would climb the terraces of Deir el-Bahari, looking out over the Valley of the Kings. The stars glittered above the cliffs, eternal and indifferent. "I have ruled as Amun's daughter," she whispered. "I have brought peace. If I must return to him now, let Egypt remember me kindly." But the gods are not kind, nor are men. Somewhere deep within the palace, plans were already taking form. Quiet words between priests and generals, between the living king and those eager for change. The sunset of Hatshepsut's reign had begun, beautiful, golden, and fatally calm. The end came not with war nor with rebellion, but with silence. One day the court simply announced that Pharaoh Hatshepsut had joined the gods. No funeral procession was described, no public mourning held. The most powerful woman in Egypt's history simply vanished. Some said she died peacefully in her chambers at Deir el-Bahari, surrounded by incense and whispers of Amun. Others believed her death was no act of nature, that those who had long waited for her throne finally seized their moment. Historians still debate it, but Egypt itself kept quiet. The gods, it seemed, had accepted her or taken her. Her body was laid to rest in a tomb hidden in the Valley of the Kings, sealed with blessings meant to protect her for eternity. Gold, perfumes, and statues filled the chamber. On the walls, her story was carved in scenes of triumph. Her divine birth, her voyage to Punt, her coronation beside the gods. She had planned everything herself, even in death. Control was her final act of power. But outside those walls, the world began to change. Thutmose III ascended the throne alone, and with him came a quiet vengeance. Orders spread through the temples and workshops. Her statues were to be smashed, her name chiseled off walls, her face erased from history. It was the ultimate death in Egypt, the death of remembrance. To erase a name was to kill the soul twice, once in the flesh and again in eternity. Yet even as her image crumbled, the spirit of Hatshepsut lingered in every monument, every column, every heartbeat of the Nile. She had ruled so wisely. A body can be buried. A name can be cut from stone. But destiny survives. When Thutmose III finally took the throne alone, Egypt roared again with the sound of soldiers. The young warrior king unleashed campaigns across Nubia and the Levant, carving his name into foreign stones, the way he wished to carve it into eternity. Yet for all his victories abroad, a quieter, darker campaign began at home, the erasure of Hatshepsut. He ordered her cartouche chiseled from temple walls, her statues smashed, her images buried beneath new carvings of his own glory. At Karnak, workers scraped her name from the granite obelisks she had raised, replacing it with his. The reliefs that once told of her divine birth were hacked away, as if the gods themselves had disowned her. It was more than vengeance. It was reclamation. Thutmose wanted history to forget that a woman had ever ruled Egypt as Pharaoh. Each hammer strike was both punishment and denial, an effort to rewrite time itself. But some artisans, secretly loyal to her memory, defied the order in quiet rebellion. They carved her likeness behind columns in hidden corners. Beneath layers of plaster, tiny fragments of truth buried inside the lies of empire. Still, the destruction was vast. For centuries afterward, Hatshepsut's reign disappeared from the official records. Future generations would read lists of kings and find a missing name where her legacy should have stood. And yet, fate had the last word. For every erased stone, one monument still stood. Deir el-Bahari, her temple, impossible to destroy, immortal against the cliffs. Thutmose could strip her name, but not her design. He could silence her titles, but not her triumph. In trying to erase her, he made her eternal, for only legends invite such fear. For nearly 3,000 years, Hatshepsut's name was dust. Her obelisks still glimmered in the sun, her temple still towered over the cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, but no one knew who had built them. Her cartouches were gone, her face erased, her story swallowed by the sands. Egypt moved on, generation after generation, as if she had never existed. And yet history has a strange memory. Beneath layers of stone and silence, fragments of her survived. A half-broken statue here, an inscription there, hints of a ruler the records could not explain. Scholars puzzled over the evidence. The balance of peace during a mysterious reign, the unmatched architecture, the trade routes that flourished under a name that no one could read. Centuries later, in the 19th century, explorers and archaeologists returned to the Valley of the Kings. Among the ruins, they uncovered walls carved with scenes of a pharaoh wearing both crown and beard, yet possessing the features of a woman. The discovery stunned the world. Who was this forgotten ruler? Piece by piece, her story was reborn. The hieroglyphs spoke her name again. Hatshepsut, foremost of noble women, the woman pharaoh who ruled not through conquest, but through brilliance and vision. Her mummy, long lost, was finally identified in 2007, a quiet body in a humble tomb, overlooked for years. Her arms still crossed over her chest in the royal pose of kings. And so the queen who had vanished into myth stepped once more into history. The world that had buried her had no choice but to remember. Time had obeyed her command after all. She had built to outlast death, and she did. Millennia after her death, Hatshepsut rose again, not in flesh, but in memory. Her story, once shattered by envy and buried by time, now shines brighter than the gold she once wore. Historians, poets, and dreamers speak her name with awe. The woman who became Pharaoh, the mortal who rewrote the laws of gods and men. Today her temple at Deir el-Bahari stands like an open hand to the sky, carved into the cliffs that guard the Nile. Every sunrise paints its columns in gold, and the wind carries whispers of her voice, steady, proud, unbroken. The same voice that once commanded armies, tamed priests, and outwitted destiny. She ruled longer and more peacefully than most kings of her dynasty. She proved that leadership was not born of gender or lineage, but of vision and courage. She showed the world that building was stronger than burning, and that power could wear the face of wisdom. Her monuments still guard her secret, that true immortality does not come from temples or crowns, but from the idea of courage itself, from daring to become what the world forbids. When visitors stand before her temple today, they often feel something, not fear, not awe, but a quiet sense of defiance echoing through the stone. It's as if her spirit watches, whispering across ages, "I was erased, yet I endure. I was doubted, yet I reigned. I was woman, yet I was Pharaoh." And with those words, Hatshepsut's story closes not as tragedy, but as triumph. The sands tried to silence her, the gods stayed silent, but time itself, time bowed to her will.